Okay, thank you very much, and nice to see so many faces in the online room here. So my name is Jonathan White. I'm Professor of Politics at the LSE, and I'm very pleased to moderate this session. I guess I come at this as someone with a research interest in the politics of the future, ideas of the future in politics and democracy, and of course, climate change is perhaps one of the overriding ideas that looms over contemporary politics and gives it a certain futurity and shapes the expected future that is referenced in so many parts of contemporary politics. So I come at this with an interest in ideas of the future and, of course, specifically in climate change, populism, democracy, and so on. So I'm very pleased to introduce the speaker, Erik Swyngedouw, who is going to be talking on under the title of The Climate Deadlock and the Unbearable Lightness of Climate Populism. I'm sure you know Professor Swyngedouw without much need of an introduction. He's, of course, Professor of Geography at the University of Manchester. I think I first came across his work in the form of the 2010 piece on Apocalypse Forever, which is clearly one of those extremely influential and important texts about how we think about climate change and the political implications thereof. He's the author of a number of extremely well cited and influential books and articles. I've got on my list here Promises of the Political, Liquid Power and Social Power and the Urbanization of Nature. And I believe there is more to come in the short term under the intriguing title of Enjoying Climate Change, a book I think they'll be out with Verso fairly soon. I will hand over to Erik without further ado. I believe it's around 40 minutes or so of speaking time. Then there'll be plenty of time for everyone to talk further, to come up with questions and to thrash out these questions around climate populism. So Erik, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for your very nice introduction. Thank you very much also for the ECPS to invite me for this Zoom session. Welcome to all of you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on the geographical location where you are at this moment. The key point I want to make before I share my screen, because after that you can just doze off because all the other things are less important. But the key point I want to make, and I would like you to remember, if there is one thing I want you to remember from this session, if we really want to take the climate serious, and we should, and I think most of us in this room would agree that the climate is a serious condition, that if we really want to take that seriously, we have to stop focusing on the climate. That is the key message, and I'm going to try to explain in my lecture as to why the focus on the climate that characterizes so much of the climate consensus that is out there is utterly impotent on the one hand, and on the other hand, actually is characterized by what I have argued, characterized by a classic populist architecture. So that's the introduction. I'm going now to share my screen, if I succeed in doing so. Can you all see my screen? Okay. So the title of my talk is The Climate Deadlock and the Unbearable Lightness of Climate Populism. It's based on a forthcoming book that Jonathan already kindly pitched for me. It's coming out hopefully in a few months' time. I co-authored it with Lucas Pohl, and it has indeed this kind of intriguing title, Enjoying Climate Change. I'm going to lift a little tip of the veil of that book, which is much more than about populism, but one of the chapters focuses on what I'm going to talk about. So what are the core arguments that I want to convey? So in contrast to widespread belief that populism is the prerogative of right-wing and occasionally left-leaning, autocratic, xenophobic, allegedly anti-elite, climate skeptic and ultra-nationalist movements with a penchant for spinning facts and mobilizing the affective pull of post-truth discourses, I shall argue that, in fact, the architecture of most mainstream, as well as more radical, not all, but many of the more radical climate discourses, policies, and practices, that is strictly parallel to populist discourses and practices, and that this should be understood, this populist nature of the hegemonic mainstream climate consensus should be understood as an integral part of what I would argue is a pervasive and still deepening process of de or post-geopoliticization. That's the argument. So I shall argue that the knowledge and the science about climate change, which is considerable, becomes mobilized in a post-truth discourse that actually obscures what really, with a capital R, shapes the socio-climatic condition. And in doing so, in doing that obscuring, it keeps the climatic gaze and climate interventions circulating around what I and others have called the fetishized thing. That is greenhouse gases, CO2, methane, NOx, etc., which I shall argue functions as a fetish in the classic psychoanalytic sense of the word, to assure that nothing really changes. And I would argue that accounts, in part at least, for the climate deadlock that we're in. And what I mean by the climate deadlock that we're in is that while there is significant knowledge, and while there is a widely held consensus from the mainstream to radical activists about the truth of climate change and the urgency to take action, not much is actually really changing. So this is the deadlock of the situation. The climate parameters are getting worse every day. And this despite the knowledge, the science, and all manner of interventions, activities, technologies, and more or less radical activism. So I'm going to mobilize a Marxist, Lacanian, psychoanalytically inflected gaze that I hope might elucidate this impasse. And in particular, I'm going to do it from the standpoint of the most passionate climate activists and movements, those who really say we want to change and we need to change in order to deal with climate breakdown and its catastrophic consequences. So I claim that much of the climate discourse and action dwells in opposed to the repression of the real of the situation, reveling in what psychoanalysts call the surplus enjoyment of hysterical acting out. You were hearing in the previous talk about throwing paint or tomato soup at paintings. That's hysterical acting out at its best. Melancholic despair, social fantasies of eco-modern sustainability, consumerist ethical action. And I'm sure most of you do recycle, don't try to fly too much, etc. And techno-managerial fixes that actually sustain, I claim, our libidinal attachment to the existing socio-ecological order, and that nurtures a belief that we can continue doing what we're doing, provided that CO2 and its avatars are managed appropriately. So we insist that change is needed and some sort of change is happening, but to make sure that nothing really changes. So this echoes a bit of what Alain Badiou, the French philosopher, already said 17 years ago when he made the, at the time, quite controversial statement when he said, let's start by stating that after the rights of man, the rise of the rights of nature is a contemporary form of the opium of the people. It's only a slightly camouflaged religion. It's a gigantic operation in the depoliticization of subjects. I'm going to argue that the dominant, hegemonic, and even part of the radical climate discourse expresses precisely this. So, this is the outline of my talk. I'm going to say first something very briefly about what I consider to be the deadlock of the climate consensus, to then move on to say a bit about this fetishistic disavowal and how CO2 and its avatars have been construed as the object cause of desire, meaning that if we can deal with climate change, if we can bring CO2 down, then we can possibly produce a socially more just, inclusive, and environmentally sensible world. That's a lie. Third, I'm going to then discuss how we succumb to the climate populist temptation and how that articulates with a post-truth depoliticization. So basically, I'm talking about us here, not the usual culprits, the Trumps, the Bolsonaros, etc. To then say something about the real of the climate condition, which I think is systematically disavowed, at least in the mainstream. And then to conclude how we can transgress this populist gaze in order, hopefully, to begin to do something seriously about the climate breakdown that is getting more seriously every day. So, first of all, the deadlock of the climate consensus. So as I just said, there is a widely shared consensus, with the exception of right-wing populists, about the climate as a real and imminent danger that is articulated around nurturing an imaginary of a potential future calamity catastrophe that is deepening by the ongoing climate catastrophe. However, despite the mobilization of all manner of social, technical, and institutional dispositif, and occasionally intense social activism, the real of climate change keeps galloping forward. Just a few numbers: between 1970 and 2020, there was a 70% increase in greenhouse gas emissions. The concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere was 413 ppm, way off the 300 ppm, the kind of magical number that some climate scientists put forward in 2020. In February 2024, it was 424.55, and yesterday it was 428.45, and keeps on climbing. 2021, for those who remember, major COVID year, showed the second highest increase in annual greenhouse emissions ever recorded. In 2023, still COVID, greenhouse gas emissions increased by 1.1%. More worryingly, over the past few months, and in the context of intensifying geopolitical tensions and associated populist discourses, the climate problem, whether it's in the United States, the European Union, or elsewhere, has moved to the back burner of the policy agenda. No one really cares any longer, as far as I can tell. So as Kevin Anderson, a colleague of mine at Manchester University, climate scientist from the Tyndall Center, stated, we have delivered 3 decades of abject failure. A litany of technocratic fraud has marked climate policy. And these are the words of a climate scientist, not a fluffy social scientist. So there is a clear, I would argue, cognitive dissonance. That's what psychologists call it. I'm going to call it fetishistic disavowal. A gap between knowing the truth and acting according to the knowledge of that truth. So here are just some indications of how CO2, as we all know. The interesting thing is that the European Union often claims, quite correctly, that its climate policies are working to a certain extent because CO2 emissions are going down in the European Union. That is correct. But of course, that is massively compensated by massive increases in China, India, and elsewhere, in part to deal with the rising internal production, but also to satisfy our consumption in the European Union. So in order to make sense of that cognitive disavowal, I mobilize a Lacanian psychoanalytic perspective. So this cognitive dissonance, I know very well, but nonetheless, je sais bien, mais quand même, is a statement by Octavio de Manoni, psychoanalyst, Belgian psychoanalyst, actually. And I'm going to talk about fetishistic disavowal and how CO2 has been staged almost hegemonically as an object cost of desire. If we want to have a climate sensible world that is socially potentially more inclusive, we have to deal with greenhouse gases. So cognitive dissonance or fetishistic disavowal can be formulated that despite the fact I know very well the facts of climate change and the need for an ecologically sensible and socially just society, I nonetheless act as if I do not know. What is the depressed, disavowed, or foreclosed, this gap in the middle is, I would argue together with others, a libidinal attachment to the present status quo, including the pleasure of critiquing it while painfully enjoying it. And I would argue it's precisely the discourse, a practice of both eco-management and activists. You were talking earlier about Extinction Rebellion throwing paint at artwork in museums. You can almost sense the enjoyment of the radical activist in doing this form of hysterical acting out. So for Jacques Lacan, the psychoanalyst, cognitive dissonance takes the form of fetishistic disavowal. There's something that is disavowed, which is the unsymbolizable real of the situation, real with a capital R. That is the socio-technical, I'll come back to that later, the socio-technical and political economic class mechanisms and accumulation dynamics that drive the climate system. And I think very few people would disagree that accumulation, endless growth, and the dynamics of a broadly understood capitalism is the engine of greenhouse gas emission. On the one hand, that is disavowed, and the trauma. I heard the previous speaker also talk about trauma. The trauma that I wanted to talk about is the trauma to having to face the need for radical social political transformation. That's traumatic. So fetishistic disavowal, operates in the form of a displacement of the discursively symbolized desire. When I ask most climate-sensitive subjects what they want, what they desire, most of them would respond to me. We want a socially more inclusive, politically more democratic, and environmentally more sensible world. That's the big desire that motivates, so they say, their climate activism. But they switch that, displace it onto a little thing in the imaginary that stand in for the bigger and apparently unachievable desire. That is the systemic transformation that is required in order to have a more socially just, politically democratic, and environmentally sensible society. That's too big, too frightening, too fearful to act. So is displaced on something else, what Jacques Lacan calls the little object of desire. And in this case, I would argue that greenhouse gases and their acting is constituted as such an object, as the little thing that stands in for the bigger unachievable thing. It's strictly parallel to the sexual notion, the eroticized notion of fetishism. We call a fetishist someone who likes a shoe or underwear but cannot face the trauma of dealing with the full person. So desire becomes articulated around CO2 that then is fantasized as the little thing around which, or that is the key pivot around which a better world can be constituted. Enjoyment circles around this in a painful and strangely partially satisfying manner. Most climate-sensitive subjects recycle, try not to fly too much, or vegan or vegetarian, buy EVs, get involved in obsessive climate activism, while we all know this does not make even the beginning of a dent in the history of the future of the climate. So CO2 in some and other greenhouse gases operate as a fetish object. The phantasmic desire, albeit genuine, for a different society and a different environment becomes framed around handling CO2 as the privileged object to redirect the history of the future. It hides, I would contend, that subjects do not really desire a different socio-ecological order. And I would argue that the outcome of that leads to a discourse of which its architecture is strictly parallel to what we usually understand with populism, although we assign that usually to the right, to a particular segment of the socio-political spectrum. So I'm going now to argue how this desire that gets articulated around CO2 as the way into fighting climate change leads to what I call a post-truth depoliticization, which is strictly parallel to a populist argument. So the particular consensualization of the climate conundrum, the mobilization of an apocalyptic imaginary, the technocratic commodification of greenhouse gas emissions, neoliberal individualized responsibilization and guilt, and the focus on techno-managerial interventions as the dispositives, the key dispositives to deflect the climate future unfolds, I would argue, in parallel to a deepening populism. Mainstream climate discourse and policy that articulates on the pressing need for a sustainable, socially just, and climate-sensitive future in light of the accelerating climate catastrophe is characterized by a string of populist arguments and post-truth discourses. There is indeed an uncanny formal discursive parallel between right-wing xeno-nationalist populism on the one hand and progressive, presumably progressive, liberal climate arguments on the other. Of course, they're not saying the same thing. They're saying very different things, but the architecture of the discursive configuration and the forms of actions are comparable. So both forms are symptoms of a deepening depoliticization of the existing socio-ecological configuration. And that's what I mean by the unbearable lightness of climate populism. So this unbearable lightness of climate populism, let me summarize this. This is the summary of the hegemonic but widely shared view that there is a global humanitarian threat caused by either elites that pursue their own interests and through that destroy nature and community, and or there's an alien invader, the greenhouse gas emissions, that require elimination, mitigation, or sequestration by means of mobilizing a particular set of dispositives, such as market-conformed technologies and associated institutional reforms. Exactly the dispositives that caused the problem to begin with. That is market-conformed technologies and institutions. They caused the problem, and they're now mobilized as potential solutions. Such tactics, the dominant argument insists, would presumably avoid the catastrophe apocalypse, and it does so in the name of sustaining humanity, as if humanity exists. I'll come back to that. And restore, in doing so, if successful, but there's no chance in a million years that that's ever going to be successful, to restore a presumably lost, but nonetheless decidedly imaginary condition of a once existing Arcadian socio-ecological and climate harmony. If you could get the climate just back to 300 ppm, everything would be at least would offer the beginning of a better world. That's a populist argument. Let me now go to the architecture of that hegemonic climate discourse, which I argue that climate change discourse is actually the Trojan horse, one of the Trojan horses, not the only one, of populist post-politicization. Let me go through 12 theses. Some of them were in that 2010 paper that Jonathan mentioned earlier. And while I go through those 12 examples, think about the standard right-wing populist discourse and practice and replace in your imaginary when I use CO2 or greenhouse gases with the migrant to illustrate the parallel in architecture. So the climate change, the hegemonic climate change argument invokes the people, if not humanity as a whole, and does so both in a material and philosophical matter. Humanity and the non-human, often too, is under threat, which of course assumes that humanity exists. It's increasingly evident, I would argue, that humanity does not exist. I only have to refer to Gaza, the greatest not only social catastrophe, but the environmental catastrophe is just unspeakable, in addition to the social, to always hang together, or the Ukraine. It cuts the hegemonic climate discourse, it cuts across ideological and social differences. It's predicated upon a presumably common threat, common challenge that affects everyone, although it's understood that it is uneven. Nonetheless, it affects everyone negatively, and it does so, it's a challenge for both nature and humanity. It's based on a politics of the people know best, although who or what exactly constitutes the people is entirely unclear, exactly like in a populist argument, but supported by an assumedly neutral scientific technocracy. It's predicated upon short-circuiting. The right-wing populist discourse does that too. The migrant is the cause of all the problems, so we have to deal with the migrant. The climate argument is very similar. It's short-circuiting matters of fact, that is, the climate is changing and greenhouse gases are indeed biochemically responsible for the climate change effect. And that, without proper intermediation, is then turned into a matter of concern, to use the Latourian distinction between matter of fact and a matter of concern, which translate a consequence of something that causes climate change, CO2, into the matter of concern. It assumes the relationship between people and political participation. Most of the kind of arguments around how to deal with climate change in an institutional governance way is through nurturing, advocating, stimulating forms of participatory governance. It, of course, invokes apocalyptic futures. If we do not deal with greenhouse gases, the catastrophe is upon us. Strictly parallel to the right-wing, the migration argument. If we don't deal with the refugees and undocumented migrant, the apocalypse is nigh. Which, of course, disavows the real of the existing combined and uneven catastrophe. I'm sitting here in my hotel room in Istanbul. I'm at a conference here. It is really, really hot outside. It's damn piping hot outside. But I have the air conditioning on. I'm not suffering too much from the heat because I can escape from it. When I look out the window, I can see that not everyone can escape in the same way. The climate discourse also has no privileged subject as an agent of social change. Compare and contrast that with other emancipatory, transformative social and political movements from the past. The proletariat for the socialists, women for the feminists, African Americans for human rights, etc. The climate change argument has no privileged subjects. They're only agents that prevent our enjoyment. The enemy is continuously externalized. And this enemy, greenhouse gases, is fetishized. It becomes a thing. It's ambiguous. It's socially empty. It's homogenized. Although we all know, of course, what the mechanisms of the making of this heterogeneous gaseous configuration of CO2, methane, NOx is all about, in how we deal with it, it becomes socially disembodied, commodified, homogenized. A ton of CO2 is a ton of CO2 is a ton of CO2, irrespective of time, place, and history. Problems, therefore, are not the result of a fatal flaw inscribed in the system. And that is why the dominant climate solution arguments can be found, allegedly, in dealing with the pathological phenomenon, the symptom, the excess, the supernumerary point element, the resolution of which resides in the system. If you could just cut the excess CO2, we can just continue with our lives. Climate activism and also climate policies become expressed in particular demands that relate to that particular thing and are addressed to the elites in a call to act decisively, which is, of course, the opposite of political transformation, which is about changing the elites, transforming the elites, displacing the existing elites by others. Proposed solutions, therefore, do not solve the problem, but move them around. My favorite example these days is AI, not because of the appropriation of the collective intellect and the consequences thereof, which is bad enough, but in the exponentially expanding energy demand upon which the exponentially growing AI revolution is based. And we all know that the great AI mega companies have already concluded all sorts of contracts to make sure that the energy provision for the AI systems will be in place in 5 and 10 years' time. It's Google's and Amazon's nuclear option. That's what I mean by moving things around rather than solving it. So, what makes this climate populist argument, of which I've now given 12 of the key characteristics, so attractive? Why do we fall, many of us, from the radical to the mainstream? Why this lure? What is the lure of this climate populist argument? So as I just said, the climate populist argument is predicated upon the disavowal, the depression of the real of the climate catastrophe. I'll come back to that in a moment, say a bit more about that real. The disavowal of that, the repression of that, in classic psychoanalytic sense of the word, it permits to take the climate question seriously. And very few people do not take it seriously. And these three things operate simultaneously. Secondly, it permits to situate the solution within the contours of the technical and managerial institutional governance arrangement while preserving the present situation. Third, so that no fundamental changes have to be contemplated or implemented in the existing socio-ecological power relations. In fact, we are changing rapidly in technical, institutional ways so that nothing really has to change, so that things can go on as normal. It is in this sense that the climate debate and policy is in itself politicizing and constitutes, quite rightly, as Badiou more generally put it 15 years ago, a new opium of the people. So to conclude this, fetishistic disavowal depoliticizes environmental matters. So what is this disavowal? What is being disavowed? First of all, the mad dance of accumulation and its constitutive class dynamics, as David Harvey and many others would call it, as the real mechanism that can be ignored and displaced onto the terrain of its symptom CO2, that needs to be managed, such that the mad dance of accumulation can continue. It leads to what Slavoj Žižek and others have called obsessive or hysterical climate activism. Don't have time to go into forms of obsessive or hysterical climate activism, but both of them are forms of impotent acting out. And for Jacques Lacan, acting out is a form of acting that keeps the disease, the suffering intact. It leads to the mobilization of a whole string, and here I just have a few, of a whole string of consensual, but depoliticizing empty signifiers. That is, signifiers with an empty, not an uncertain, empty content. That's why we have full libraries being written on them, and we still don't know exactly, precisely what those signifiers mean. And I'm thinking here of signifiers like sustainability, mitigation, adaptation, transition, or resilience, and there are plenty of others of that kind, but these are some of the key ones. There's no one who disagrees with that. It's a consensualizing the trope, but in its substantive content, empty. It nurtures this disavowal, it nurtures a political practice founded still on an ontological outside. The nature-humanity split is sustained. So this is for me the depoliticizing and uncannily populist, phantasmic narrative and practice of the climate catastrophe consensus. So let me now go to the real of the climate condition. I can be fairly short about that. This figure actually sums it all up, but I'll give you some more concrete examples in a moment. If we look at the history of GDP, the growth of GDP, what people call economic growth, what others call accumulation, and the growth of greenhouse gas emissions, the correlation is nearly 100%. Right. So the cause of greenhouse gas emissions, as we all know, I think very few of you would actually disagree with me, that it is a growth obsessive. Well, it's not obsessive. Capitalist growth is a necessity to sustain our societies. Growth is a necessity for sustainability. No, without growth, we have a crisis. And the socio-ecological order that collapses as any moment of capitalistic crisis demonstrates. But there's a close association between accumulation, economic growth, etc. Any attempt by some eco-modernists to argue for a disconnect between economic growth and its environmental implications is fantasy land. Is fantasy land, as I tried to illustrate earlier. Artificial intelligence is going to have an extraordinary environmental onslaught energetically and in terms of resource extraction, just to name an example of the radical impossibility of a disconnect between economic growth, or capitalist growth, and its ecological or environmental impact. That is an ideological fantasy at its very best. So let me give a few examples of the real of the situation that is often ignored. Take internet use or our Zoom conversation now, yeah, and the emails associated with it. A system that is often portrayed as an integral part of a post-material creative service economy. We're actually doing it right now, and therefore environmentally more friendly. I don't have to fly to Brussels to do this. I can do it from my hotel room here. Internet use is responsible for an estimated 830 million tons of CO2, equivalent or about 2% of total climate emissions. aviation is responsible for about 2.5%. Internet use, the AI revolution is going to exponentially increase that. Every purchase of a smartphone or tablet, any one of you wants to give up on your tablet or smartphone? I don't, by the way. Is equivalent to 22 kilograms of CO2 emissions. There are about 3.5 billion smartphones in the world. The socio-ecological footprint of the average smartphone contributes to eroding further the already fragile socio-ecological, the resilience and carrying capacity of the region around the Great Lakes in Central Africa. Think of the Congo, Rwanda. Social and ecological catastrophe. We all know what is at stake in that war. It's our coltan, our IT equipment, which are crucial components for any ITC equipment, and is mined in environments often controlled by local militia and organized by Chinese mining companies very often. I heard earlier in your talk, you're talking about decolonization. That's very easy for us to do now because we have subcontracted our imperial and colonial practices to the Chinese, and we can wash our hands in innocence and discuss forms of decolonization and sending pieces of museum exhibitions back, which we should do, by the way. But I think some more thought is required. The development of AI is leading to an exponential rise in energy demand and consumption. The top 10% of emitters were responsible for almost half of global energy-related CO2 emissions in 2021. It's not everyone who does that. Most people do not emit much greenhouse gases at all. So the 10% lowest emitters emit 0.2% of the total. As the Stockholm Environment Institute estimates, the richest 0.1% of the world's population emitted 10 times more than all the rest of the richest 10% combined, exceeding a total footprint of 200 tons of CO2 per capita annually. We will easily surpass the Paris Agreement objectives if we get rid of those 1%. There's not that many. Nonetheless, the reel of capital, with its constitutive class antagonisms, of which I've just given an empirical example, and the related socio-ecological disintegration, is disavowed and displaced onto a series of fantasies articulated around those basically empty signifiers. But which ultimately are all commensurable with further supporting a logic of infinite cumulative growth, a process for which really there is not enough Earth. Unless we get rid of some people, as we actually do. I'll come back to that. It is within the paradoxical condition in which most people simultaneously know the realities of irreversible environmental change, yet knowingly unknow the very mechanisms and dynamics that produce this deep anthropogenic epoch. Here we encounter the classic formula of fetishistic disavowal. Despite the fact we know very well, let me get this somewhere else. Despite the fact we know very well the facts of climate and environmental change, we act as if we do not know. So I'm going to conclude now by how we might want to or can begin to think about yet transgressing the populist climate gaze, the populist climate fantasy. And I would argue that one of the places we might want to start is to interrogate the symptomatic base upon which the populist legitimacy of the environmental discourse, practice, and movement and activities of many climate movement is predicated, what these arguments rest upon. And I would argue that these are based on two repressed traumas opening up a different political, ecological trajectories that permits the proper politicization of the environment. It requires transgressing the fantasies that conceal these traumas. So the two I want to focus on, there are others, but in the interest of time, I'm going to focus on two. So first, there is an insistent construction of a dystopian, quasi-catastrophic future that needs to be averted. And as the climate collapse intensifies, and we see it now happening, this image of a dystopian, catastrophic future intensifies even more. Second, the apocalyptic climate discourse is mobilized through invoking the imminent dangers it poses to humanity, to human civilization. And that humanity, so the fantasy goes, needs to be saved. So let me say something about these two fantasies. So the apocalyptic imaginary maintains in its mainstream framing that it's not too late yet. It's always, I've been hearing that for 30 years now, it's always 5 minutes to 12, never 5 minutes after 12, after midnight. It nurtures fear as a central leitmotif of what I would argue are the cultural politics of the neoliberal order. Fear is a classic yet trope that works in deeply depoliticizing manners. It disavows and displaces political conflict by invoking a universal humanitarian threat. And this apocalyptic imaginary is nurtured while at the same time arguing that can be avoided, that we can change the history of the future through techno-managerial adjustments. Yeah. It's not really too late. We can still do it, but we have to act urgently. And of course, this disavows the combined and uneven nature of the socio-climatic condition. So how to transgress that? There are three elements. I think the revelatory promise of the apocalyptic narrative has to be fully rejected. So in the face of the cataclysmic imaginaries mobilized to assure that the apocalypse will not happen if the right techno-managerial actions are taken, the only reasonable response today is, don't worry, you eco-modernizers, COP meeting people, and many environmental activists, you are really right. The environmental apocalypse will not happen. It has already happened. It is already here. Not for all. Not for me, and I hope not for many of you. But many are already living in the post-apocalyptic interstices of life, whereby the fusion of environmental transformation and social conditions renders life bare. So the fact that the socio-ecological imbroglio has already passed the point of no return has to be fully asserted. There is no hope in this traditional configuration. So the socio-environmental ruin is already here for many, sometimes a bit helped by the geopolitics of socio-ecological destruction, which we have seen over the past few years in rarely seen ways. It's not some distant dystopian promise mobilized to trigger response today. Water conflicts, struggles for food, environmental or climate refugees, rampant extractivism that renders some socio-ecological constellations unlivable, etc., testify to the socio-ecological predicament that choreographs everyday life for the majority of the world's population. Things are already too late. Things have always already been too late for them. There is no Arcadian place, time, nature, or environment to return to. no benign global socio-ecological past or an ideal climate that needs to be maintained or stabilized. It's only within the realization of the apocalyptic reality of the now that the new politics might emerge. If we take indeed seriously the reality that the apocalypse is combined but uneven, that my electrical vehicle that keeps my urban life in Amsterdam, I actually don't have an electrical vehicle, doesn't matter, makes it sustainable in Amsterdam, leads to socio-ecological destruction elsewhere. The second fantasy is the fantasy of humanity. So I'm going to argue together with Maurice Blanchot, French philosopher of the 1960s, that humanity does not exist. So the apocalyptic climate discourse that I just mentioned is mobilized to invoking the imminent dangers it poses to humanity and to the non-human world. As Maurice Blanchot already argued in the early 1960s, and he was writing in the context of the nuclear apocalyptic promise of the time, the Cold War time. This view is predicated upon the fantasy that humanity actually exists, that there is a global human civilization that requires or deserves salvation. This is precisely a repressed trauma, namely the knowledge that there is no, or not yet, such a thing as humanity. It may never do, unless a sustained political fidelity to its possible making is inaugurated. The disavowal in the climate discourse of the barbarism that actually characterizes humankind, that is actually the cause of climate change, is a classic form of traumatic depression. Oops. According to Blanchot, the fundamental challenge is the choice between an apocalyptic future that speeds ahead precisely because of the absence of humanity. So, indeed, and I'm concluding now, my last slide, indeed a significant post-truth imaginary seeps into the dominant apocalyptic climate discourse, a phantasmagoria of an abstract but threatened global humanity. Now, just looking at what's happening in the Ukraine, Gaza, Iran, places in Latin America, Central Africa, it's clear, I think, what I'm referring to. In doing so, the reel of class and other antagonisms that cut to the semblance of humanity is considered irrelevant, or at least subordinate, in the face of climate change. The fetishistic disavowal or foreclosure of the class and other antagonisms that form the matrix of the social assures that nothing will really change. So to conclude, traversing the fantasy is predicated upon reversing the dominant argument, recognizing that it is already too late for many, not for all. The apocalypse has already happened, and the only possible thing left to do is to engage in a process of constructing a real humanity, of producing a human world in the world. Someone like Marx, but many others, and also Blanchot, named the process of which the given is transformed in the direction of the making of humanity. He named that communism. I thank you.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Erik, for this excellent presentation.